am a biodiversity strategy manager at Network Rail, who manage the railway infrastructure in the UK. I'm going to talk to you today about a project we've been doing, targeted tree and habitat establishment alongside the operational railway in Great Britain to benefit safety, people and nature. And this is some work that we've been doing with Professor Richard Pywell at the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, John Stokes from the Tree Council, and also David West from the Forestry Commission. My presentation today will just cover a little bit of an introduction to the rail network in Britain, also then talking about the project, looking at some of the data we've been collecting, the tool that we've developed, the sort of model that we're then hoping the tool will help us to push out onto the railway, and then how this can be a benefit to not only the railway but others as well. So the railway estate in Britain, you can see there in the image on the right hand side, covers the length and breadth of Scotland, England and Wales, and the size of our estate is about 52,000 hectares of land. Within that we have that's 32,000 kilometres of railway line. Now if you take 52,000 hectares of land and you squash it all up into a lump, that is about 3 lots of Cluj-Napoca, just to put that into context for where the conference is today. And of that estate, 1/3 of it is made up of a lot of infrastructure, the electrification, the signalling systems, the railway tracks themselves, and also a lot of Victorian infrastructure like that bridge you can see in the central photo there. And then the bottom image just gives an indication that we also have those trains running up to 200 kilometres an hour underneath power lines, 25,000 volts. So a very challenging environment to work in. But the other 2/3 of the estate, that's the interesting place. That's where all the biodiversity and the habitats are. We have a lot across the whole of the network, amphibians, reptiles, you name it, we've got it. We have some globally rare species of tree on our estate, but all making their homes in and around the infrastructure that we are operating. And this is where the project comes into its own. We have a number of targets to achieve biodiversity net gain by 2035, which have been set by the British government. And this project was looking at how we can influence the amount of tree planting that we know is going to take place in Britain over the next 20 or 30 years, and to make sure that when those trees are planted, they don't cause any impact or pose any future risk to railway operations. So we wanted to look at how we could target where trees and other habitats could be established next to the operational railway. And the key bit being trying to identify those places where we don't want the trees, whether that's through operational reasons or whether that's because what's already on the land adjacent to the railway. But the key bit is to find those places where we do and we can have that opportunity to change the habitat or to improve the habitats that we've got. And by doing that, then we'll be able to look at how we can then start to plant those trees and make sure that they then don't have any impact on the operational railway. So in order to understand where the railway sits in the landscape, we worked with the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology to get use the land cover maps to identify the habitat types that's not only are on our estate, running down the middle of that stripe there, but also we've taken the data up to 1 kilometre beyond our boundary fence. That gives us 3.2 million hectares of land data that we can see where the railway sits within that context. And for example, the red colours there on that image show where the broadleaf woodland are. So we can see where the railway fits and where the woodlands are and other habitats and how we fit into that landscape. And the tool that we've developed, therefore, has taken a number of what we've called attractors and constraints. What we're looking at trying to identify is those places where we should be or could put in woodland next to the railway, not on our land, but on the land adjacent to it. And so the attractors are those things where they improve the quality of existing woodland, they would connect up with ancient woodland that's already in place, provide connectivity for other species that are trying to move around the landscape. But we also need to recognise that there are places where we don't want to put trees. And so we have a number of constraints in the tool, like land that is growing high quality agriculture, sites that are already designated for nature conservation. They have a habitat in their own right already. We don't want to start putting trees onto those other potentially rare habitats. And then obviously also built up areas. We have a constraint there for that. We also have an attractor for built up areas, which is the proximity to urban areas, to give people the opportunity potentially to move and see new habitats, new woodland areas. And what that presents us with is a map that you can see an example of here, where the red areas in that stripe moving from the bottom left to the top right. Those red areas are the locations where we have identified we don't want to put trees in. But the darker the green areas get, those show that they are higher quality areas for actually having successful tree establishment. And we can then take that and zoom in further, and it enables us to present maps to local communities to demonstrate that we may have removed some trees alongside the railway in one location, but actually if we're going to put trees back in the ground, we now have a tool that helps us target those locations and work with those adjacent landowners to make sure we get the right tree in the right place for the right reason. And once we then start working on the ground, we then need to make sure that we get the structure of those new woodlands, those new habitats correct, so that they don't, when they get to maturity, they don't affect the operational railway that we're working alongside. And this opportunity here gives us that ability to not only create that habitat to improve the areas for biodiversity, but also we've got the potential with, especially with the woodland, for that carbon sequestration. And also then working with those adjacent landowners, the type of woodland and areas that we're creating can fit in with the objectives of potentially the farms themselves. Are we going to move into agroforestry? But all along what we're working to, and that's that semicircle of red there, you can see, making sure that the tree species we select for planting are actually not going to start causing any problems. So the maximum height they will reach, making sure that they're planted far enough away so that they can get to maturity, but even if there was issues, they wouldn't reach the railway if they were going to fall over. And so the methodology that we've been using, the satellite data, is global. The techniques that we're using are therefore not restricted to use in the UK, and for that matter, they're not also restricted to use by the railway network. These are equally applicable to road networks, power line distribution, where we're managing linear infrastructure and we're looking to make sure that we can increase the amount of biodiversity, increase the amount of carbon sequestration, but not affect the infrastructure that those are planted alongside. And again, thank you very much to colleagues at the UK CEH Forestry Commission and the Tree Council. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you for this excellent presentation. So is there any question in the room? Yep, Lisa.
Hello, thank you very much. Yes, I have a question about the trees. So you are planting the trees, and do you have thinking about the climate change and that the fact that now the temperature will change, and if those trees will be adapted for this new program?
So it is something that we are definitely considering. We have done a piece of work to look at the ideal tree species. We have to consider not only the soil type, but as you say, also the climate. We won't be funding the tree planting ourselves. That's going to be done by the UK government. And so as part of the conditions that you need to apply for the grant to do the tree planting, you also have to take into account the future use of the woodland, but also the species choice for the location you're putting it. So it is something we're looking at. It's not of great concern given the timescales. Obviously, with trees growing, they will be there for some time. But we do have to make sure that we're putting the right things in the right places. And we do work closely with the Forestry Commission in England and the organisations in Scotland and Wales to make sure that we're getting the right advice from the tree experts as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Another question? Yep.
Thank you. Do you actually own land far in the right distance to be able to plant them and they can fall over and not reach the railway?
In some places we do. The average width from the rail to the fence across the whole of the railway in Britain is only 12 metres, but we do have some areas which are quite substantial, up to 200-300 metres away from the railway. And our trees don't get that big in Britain. But also one of the things is that because of environmental legislation that we now have in the UK, there are some times when conditions of work that we're doing, either through biodiversity offsetting or because of the planning permission that the organisation has to get to do the work, we need to be planting trees that can be quite a way away as well. So it does vary, but basic answer to your question is yes, there are places where we do have to be careful of what we're planting.
Okay. Last question? Yep.
Yeah, the visibility was a key issue or not? Is it possible to see from the railway to see the landscape, or because sometimes I feel if it's too much trees, we can traveling in a tunnel or something like that.
Yes, definitely. We have a lot of very scenic railway, as everybody in the room will have. Those of you who are fans of Harry Potter will have seen the railway bridge that the Hogwarts Express goes over. That's one of the major tourist attractions in the west of Scotland. And exactly right. If we started planting trees so that you couldn't see the view, so you couldn't see the train going over the viaducts, then that would just not be right. And so as part of I mentioned the attractors and the constraints in that, we are looking at in a future bit of research we're doing that was a feasibility study that I talked about. The future work will look at that landscape potential and that amenity value to make sure, as you say, that when you're traveling on the train, you can actually have a view. You're not just staring at a wall of green trees.
Okay. Thank you, Neil, for those answers.